I want you to imagine, just for a second, that it's the spring of 1999.
Okay, 1999.
Right. And you are deployed in the military. You're stationed on this massive Navy ship, the USS Leyte Gulf.
Wow.
Yeah. And you are floating right in the middle of the Adriatic Sea.
Just completely cut off.
Exactly. And to really grasp the gravity of this situation, you have to completely reset your modern expectations of communication.
Right, because 1999 is, I mean, it's an entirely different universe compared to today.
Oh, totally. There are no smartphones in your pocket buzzing with notifications.
No Wi-Fi on this ship.
None at all. You are existing in total, uncompromising physical and, well, technological isolation.
It's just you and the ship.
Yeah, you're living inside this floating steel box, thousands of miles away from your home, executing this incredibly demanding, high-stress job.
Where your focus needs to be absolute.
Right. It's a profound level of detachment that, most civilians just never experience.
You don't have instant messaging. You can't just hop on a quick video call to check in on your family before you go to sleep.
No, not at all.
You're entirely severed from your civilian life. You're existing in this highly structured, enclosed military bubble.
Your reality is the ship, the ocean, and your immediate duties.
Right.
So you're out there completely disconnected. And while you are floating in the middle of the ocean, a piece of physical mail arrives.
Like an actual physical letter.
A literal handwritten letter from your mother back in the States.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You open it up, standing there in the belly of this warship, and this piece of paper accuses you of the most unthinkable, horrific crime imaginable against your own child.
That is just, that's chilling.
And the most terrifying part, you cannot do a single thing about it.
You're paralyzed.
Completely. You can't walk down to the local police precinct to clear your name. You can't, sit down with a lawyer to review the allegations.
You have zero operational control over your own life.
None. And what makes that paralysis so incredibly dangerous is that while you're floating out there, completely unable to speak for yourself or defend yourself, a massive narrative is being constructed against you.
Systematically constructed back on dry land.
Exactly. The gears of the justice system are turning, and you aren't even in the room.
Which is terrifying.
So, to understand how this sailor's life was completely dismantled, we've had to dig through an absolute mountain of sources for today's deep dive.
A massive stack of files.
We're talking thousands of pages of trial transcripts, 52 separate medical and legal documents.
Personal journals too, right?
Yeah, journals, appellate court decisions, and even New Jersey Supreme Court disciplinary records.
That's a lot to get through.
It is. And our mission today is to take all of these fragments and deconstruct what is fundamentally a masterclass in systemic failure.
We really are going to look at exactly how the justice system, the very apparatus we rely on every single day to protect the innocent, how that can be consciously manipulated by bad actors.
Because society relies on a multi-tiered filtration system.
Right. Think of it like a water purification plant.
Yeah, exactly. You have police, child protective services, medical professionals, grand juries, judges.
Each of those entities is supposed to act as an independent filter.
They're designed to catch the lies, clarify the misunderstandings, and, separate truth from fiction before a case ever reaches a courtroom.
But what happens when the very people who are operating those filters decide to weaponize them?
Think about how terrifying this is for you, sitting at home or driving in your car right now. You assume that if you're falsely accused of a crime, the truth will set you free.
You assume a doctor's clean bill of health will save you.
Or a detective's objective investigation will clear your name.
Right.
But if a man with an airtight alibi can be systematically framed by the people meant to protect the truth, well, it exposes a vulnerability that affects every single one of us.
It means the filtration system can be dismantled to frame anyone.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how a system fails this spectacularly, we can't just start with a gavel banging in a courtroom.
No, we have to go back to the bedrock of the family dynamic.
We absolutely do.
Before any of these horrific allegations materialized, we have to look at the baseline environment, like what was the standard operating procedure for this family?
Right, looking at the custody agreements and visitation logs in our sources.
So Robert Roetman and his ex-wife divorced in 1996.
Oh.
And the baseline established in the legal documents is that Robert maintained child custody, regular overnight visitation, uninterrupted summer vacations.
And alternating holidays.
Exactly. He was a highly engaged father to his daughter, Gabriella.
That's a crucial starting point. He wasn't some phantom father who suddenly popped back into the picture after years away.
Right. He was a constant, legally mandated presence in her life.
But the sources show a distinct shift starting around 1997.
His ex-wife begins attempting to limit his visitation.
And the excuse she uses is incredibly specific. She claims Gabriella is suddenly allergic to cats.
And to Robert's brother's dog.
Yeah, a dog named Nash. She argues that because of these severe allergies, Gabriella cannot stay overnight at Robert's house anymore.
And this is where we have to immediately consult the objective medical records.
Because medical records don't have an agenda.
Exactly. Across 47 separate pediatrician visits that occur over this exact period, there is not a single solitary mention of an allergy to pets.
Wait, 47 visits and 0 allergies recorded.
0. When a child has a severe allergy that prevents them from sleeping in a certain environment, a pediatrician documents it.
They prescribe medication, they note the symptoms.
Right. The complete absence of medical corroboration introduces an early critical pattern here.
The ex-wife is willing to utilize a manufactured medical narrative to control Robert's access to the child.
And that desire for control doesn't just simmer, it escalates dramatically.
If you trace the timeline in the source files, we hit this massive, undeniable catalyst on February 3, 1999.
The ex-wife, who is now remarried, sends Robert a direct email.
And she explicitly asks him to permanently surrender his parental rights.
Right, so her new husband can legally adopt Gabriella.
And the documents note this wasn't an isolated thought. She had asked him to do this twice before, in 1996 and 1997.
We really need to pause and look at the legal and psychological weight of that request.
Yeah, because in family law, asking a biological, actively involved parent to terminate their rights, that's the nuclear option.
It is the legal equivalent of erasing the biological father from existence.
It severs all ties, all decision-making authority, all visitation.
It allows a child's birth certificate to essentially be rewritten.
And Robert's response is thoroughly documented. He categorically refuses.
Categorically.
I'm trying to picture the audacity of that email. You have a father who uses all his custody time, takes his kid on summer vacations, and you just send an email saying, hey, can you legally erase yourself so my new husband can take over?
And Robert draws a hard line. He says, absolutely not.
But it's the timing of this refusal that is just mind-blowing.
That refusal happens in early February 1999.
Exactly 1 month later, in March 1999, Robert deploys with the Navy for 6 months.
If we look at this through the lens of a criminal investigator, what are the 3 core elements you always look for when dissecting a crime?
Motive, opportunity, and means.
Right. The motive here is thoroughly documented in her own writing. The legal erasure of Robert to facilitate an adoption.
His refusal created a permanent roadblock.
And the opportunity is the 6-month Navy deployment, where he is completely isolated, out of the country, and unable to defend himself.
And the means. Unfettered, uninterrupted physical access to the child and the local authorities to begin planting seeds. Let me push back for a second. If you were listening to this, you might be thinking, how do we know she was manufacturing this rather than acting out of a genuine sudden fear for her child?
Like, what if she actually suspected something?
Right. Because sometimes a parent does develop a suspicion and takes drastic action to protect their kid. How did the sources conclusively prove this was orchestrated?
That is the exact right question to ask, and the answer lies in the logic gap of her own documented behavior.
Okay, what did she do?
Just 2 days after asking for the adoption, on February 5th, 1999, she sends Robert another email.
What does it say?
She writes, quote, I know you love her and would never do anything to hurt her.
Wow.
That line alone contradicts a genuine fear of abuse, but it gets deeper. In that exact same email, she complains that Robert isn't spending enough alone time with Gabriella.
Great. She's upset he's not alone with her.
Yes. She's upset that during his limited visitation time before his deployment, he is spending time with his grandparents, his brother, his sister, and his girlfriends.
Oh, wow.
She actively insists that he isolate himself with the child.
Which defies every single human survival instinct.
Right.
If I genuinely suspect a babysitter, a family member, or an ex-spouse is harming my child, I am not sending an email saying, hey, stop bringing your family around. I want you to be completely alone in a room with my vulnerable toddler. That is absurd.
Precisely. It introduces a vital distinction in behavioral psychology, the difference between a protector and a facilitator.
Break that down.
If a parent genuinely suspects their child is being harmed, their biological and psychological imperative is to become a protector.
They build walls.
Their demands supervise visits. They integrate themselves between the child and the perceived threat. They refuse to let the child out of their sight.
Right, they become a human shield.
Exactly. But her written demands show her acting as a facilitator. She was actively pushing the child into isolated environments with the alleged threat, demanding that other adults not be present.
From a forensic standpoint, this proves the scene was being staged.
She needed a paper trail showing Robert had unsupervised physical access so she could credibly launch her allegations the second his Navy ship left port.
So the motive is the adoption, the opportunity is the deployment. But to pull this off, she needs raw material. She needs evidence to present to the police.
And the source documents outline a deeply disturbing strategy. The aggressive reinterpretation of completely mundane, verifiable childhood accidents.
Because since there was no actual abuse, she had to twist reality to create some.
We see the narrative twisting reality right from the start. Let's look at the two physical incidents presented to the authorities as proof of abuse.
Okay, incident one.
Incident one takes place in August 1998. Gabriella falls off the monkey bars at a playground in Ramsey.
And Robert and his girlfriend are standing right there.
Right. They witness the fall. They comfort the child. It results in what pediatricians commonly call a straddle injury.
Let's break that down for the listener. What is the biomechanical reality of a straddle injury? Because the phrase itself sounds severe, but the context matters.
A straddle injury is an incredibly common playground accident. Picture a child navigating monkey bars. They lose their grip, gravity takes over, and they drop straight down.
Ouch.
They land with their legs apart, striking the perineal area on the hard metal or wooden structure.
It causes immediate bruising, swelling, and physical pain.
Emergency room doctors and pediatricians see this distinct blunt force trauma all the time. It is a known, expected hazard of childhood play.
And crucially, this was completely corroborated by adult witnesses. It wasn't a secret.
Oh.
Then we have Incident 2, which happens in March 1999, right before the deployment. Gabriella falls off a bunk bed and lands on a hard plastic safety gate.
And this is a massive flashing neon sign in the trial transcripts.
Mm-hmm.
It was a legally stipulated fact agreed upon by all parties, including the prosecution and the ex-wife, that Robert wasn't even in the room when this bunk bed fall happened.
He wasn't even there. Yet when the ex-wife goes to the authorities, the narrative she presents strips away the monkey bars entirely.
It completely ignores the hard plastic gate.
It takes the documented, verified physical pain from these everyday childhood accidents and aggressively reinterprets it as physical evidence of sexual abuse perpetrated by Robert.
Astounding.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because physical falls aren't enough to build a criminal case, especially when there are witnesses to the contrary.
The ex-wife needed a behavioral hook, something the child said that could be twisted.
And that brings us to the most bizarre, heavily scrutinized detail of this entire case. The tail comment.
Right. Starting around the fall of 1997 and continuing into March 1999, Gabriella is a toddler undergoing potty training.
Very normal.
During this period, she makes a remark to her mother. She states that she doesn't need help going to the bathroom because she doesn't have a tail like her daddy.
And the adults in the room completely hijacked that word to build a criminal profile.
What's fascinating here is the absolute willful disregard for basic toddler cognitive development by the investigators.
Oh, entirely.
If you look at the psychological profile of a 2- or 3-year-old undergoing potty training, they are in a phase of active categorization.
They're acquiring vocabulary.
And pointing out anatomical differences. For a toddler to notice that a male caregiver has different anatomy, and to describe it using a literal childlike word like tail, is a standard, heavily documented developmental milestone.
Anyone who has ever potty trained a toddler knows they point out physical differences constantly. It's how their brains work.
Right.
They call things by the closest visual equivalent they know. If they know a dog has a tail, they use that word. But the adults in this case stripped away the entire context of potty training.
They projected a highly sexualized, suspicious adult lens onto a completely normal toddler observation.
They had to. Because without physical evidence of a crime, the ex-wife had to generate behavioral evidence.
She had to use psychological manipulation to get the child to produce a narrative the authorities would react to.
Which brings us to a phase of the story that I honestly find staggering. It's what the sources reveal as the medical wall.
The medical wall.
Yeah, because while this horrifying narrative of abuse was being constructed by the mother at home, an entirely different, objective reality was taking place in doctors' offices. And the contrast is jarring.
It really is. Gabriella was being seen by a Columbia-trained pediatrician, Dr. Y.
And the sources show a staggering 47 documented visits over this time frame.
47 visits is an immense volume of medical scrutiny.
We aren't talking about a kid who goes to the doctor once a year for a physical.
No, this is constant, sustained observation by a highly trained medical professional. And what do Dr. Y's clinical notes reveal across all those visits? A healthy, happy, well-appearing child.
Genital exams were conducted and were completely normal.
There were no sleep problems reported by the mother, no nightmares, no sudden behavioral regressions.
In 47 visits, Dr. Y made 0 referrals to the Division of Youth and Family Services, or DYFS.
And we need to pause on that because it's a huge point. In New Jersey, doctors operate under strict mandatory reporting laws.
Right. If I'm understanding this right, they don't even need proof to make a call, do they?
Absolutely not. The legal threshold for a medical professional is merely a reasonable suspicion of child abuse.
Wow.
If they suspect it, they are legally obligated to report it to the state. Failing to do so risks their medical license, their career, and carries severe criminal liability.
Yet, after 47 intense visits, a Columbia-trained pediatrician saw absolutely 0 basis to make a report. The medical filter worked exactly as it was supposed to.
But the ex-wife didn't let the medical filter stop her. On March 9, 1999, she pivots. She takes Gabriella to a therapist at the Advent Clinic, a woman we'll call Mrs. C.
This is right before Robert deploys.
And there's a wild detail in the clinic's intake notes. Gabriella introduces herself to the therapist as Gabriella V, using the new husband's last name.
Which is incredibly alarming from a psychological standpoint.
It is clear evidence that the psychological manipulation and rewriting of the child's identity by the mother was already heavily underway.
The mother is functionally telling the child that her biological father no longer exists in her name.
But again, despite this manipulation, therapist Mrs. C observes the child, conducts her session, and makes 0 DYFS referrals.
She sees no evidence of abuse. In fact, the ex-wife stops taking Gabriella to this therapist because, in the ex-wife's own written words, the child would not open up.
In other words, the child wasn't giving the mother the script she wanted in front of a professional.
This is the definition of doctor shopping.
Exactly.
She is shopping for a diagnosis of abuse. So on March 29, 1999, literally the exact day Robert leaves for his overseas deployment, her lawyer recommends a highly credentialed forensic psychiatrist, Dr. L.
He conducts 4 intensive clinical sessions with Gabriella.
And Dr. L's findings are a critical turning point in understanding the architecture of this false accusation.
He conducts these intensive sessions, and his conclusion is definitive. He finds 0 basis for abuse.
None.
But what he does find is undeniable clinical evidence of massive adult coaching.
Right.
He notes that Gabriella's stories don't sound like a child recounting a memory. They sound like a child reciting a disjointed script.
Yeah.
In his handwritten notes, he records Gabriella saying, quote, "Daddy's tail was stinky. The boy in the Navy told him that it was stinky."
Let me emphasize that word, not sticky. Stinky.
Yeah.
Exactly. Stinky. Dr. L uncovers the origin of this phrase, and it was a completely mundane reference to a fart joke involving Robert's Navy buddy, Scott.
It was just toddler bathroom humor.
Furthermore, in the very next breath during these sessions, Gabriella is telling Dr. L about deeply positive interactions with her father. She talks about how she misses Daddy Robert, how he plays blocks with her, how he gives her baths.
The child is expressing affection.
But Dr. L also uncovers the dark, programmed phrases being systematically forced into the child's mind by the adults at home. Phrases like, Roetman is out, V is in, and most disturbingly, Daddy listens to the devil.
The sources show the mother was actively praying to take the devil out of Daddy right in front of this little girl.
Just horrifying.
She legally erased Robert's name in a church Christmas program. Think about what that does to a toddler's sense of reality. When a child is forced to rewrite their own identity, to view their loving father as a literal demon just to secure their primary caregiver's love, it creates a profound, devastating survival mechanism. A toddler does not possess an independent critical framework to evaluate truth.
Right.
If the primary caregiver, the person they rely on for food, shelter, and literal survival, reinforces a terrifying narrative with high emotional intensity, the child has no choice but to internalize it.
They rewrite their own reality to align with the caregiver's demands in order to survive.
But importantly, Dr. L, functioning as an expert filter, recognized this immediately. He recognized it as an aggressive custody strategy, not a crime.
And because of that, he flat out refused to initiate a DYFS investigation.
He shut it down.
Let me jump in with a massive question here, because this is the part that should terrify any listener. If the top forensic psychiatrist, the primary care pediatrician after 47 visits, and a trained therapist all look at this child and definitively say, no abuse, how on earth does this move forward?
It's baffling.
Shouldn't the filtration system have closed the case right there? The experts did their jobs.
It absolutely should have ended right there in those medical offices. But this is the exact moment where this civil family matter infects the criminal justice system.
And where institutional confirmation bias takes over.
The state of New Jersey, specifically the prosecutor's office and the police, get involved. And instead of looking at the medical wall of evidence, they decide on a predetermined theory of guilt.
From that moment on, they aggressively bury any evidence that contradicts their theory.
Which introduces us to a key player in this systemic breakdown, BCPO Detective M.
And her actions, as outlined in the sources, are the absolute definition of a black box interrogation.
It starts in May 1999 and continues into November. Detective M conducts a pre-interview alone with 4-year-old Gabriella.
She sits with this highly suggestible toddler for 70 minutes.
Off camera, unrecorded, no audio, no video. Just a detective and a toddler behind closed doors.
It is a textbook example of investigative malpractice. To spend over an hour alone with a toddler before finally turning on the tape recorder to capture a brief, polished statement is terrifying from a forensic standpoint.
And what is worse, when later asked for the documentation of that 70-minute session, Detective M admits she physically destroyed her contemporaneous handwritten notes, claiming it was her normal practice.
So think about that. All the raw data, the child's initial answers, any exculpatory evidence, anything that pointed to Robert's innocence during that first hour, gone.
Destroyed by the state.
And this is exactly where that crucial word shift happens. Detective M takes Dr. L's clinical note about the stinky tail fart joke, and she changes it to sticky.
She then starts using the word sticky in leading questions to the child.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of cognitive architecture, we have to talk about the prefrontal cortex of a 4-year-old.
Right. The prefrontal cortex handles complex decision-making, logic, and memory sorting.
And in a toddler, it is highly underdeveloped.
This biological fact makes toddlers uniquely vulnerable to what psychologists call source monitoring errors.
Okay, I really want to unpack that because it sounds like a crucial piece of the puzzle. What exactly is a source monitoring error, and how does it weaponize a child's memory?
Well, source monitoring is simply the brain's ability to track where a specific memory originated. When you or I remember something, our brain tags it. Did I actually experience this event? Did I see it happen on a television show? Or did a friend tell me a story about it?
Right. Adults can usually parse that out and identify the source of the memory.
But a 4-year-old lacks that cognitive tagging system. They cannot distinguish between a genuine episodic memory of something that happened to them and a scenario that has been repeatedly, intensely suggested to them by an authority figure.
So if a police detective sits in a room and spends 70 unrecorded minutes asking leading questions using altered, highly suggestive words like sticky and positively reinforcing the child only when they give the correct dark answers,
the child's memory is fundamentally and permanently altered. The child adopts the detective's implanted narrative as their own lived reality.
What's fascinating and deeply disturbing here is that the detective wasn't extracting a hidden memory of trauma.
She was installing a memory of trauma.
She was literally writing malicious code into a highly vulnerable hard drive.
And then turning on the tape recorder to create a polished audio statement to hide her tracks. It's brilliant if your goal is just to secure a conviction, and evil if your goal is the truth.
But Detective M made one fatal error. There was a procedural crack in her black box interrogation.
Oh, a huge one.
Robert's defense attorney, Jay Atkins, is combing through mountains of discovery files, and he finds out that Detective M wasn't alone at the facility that day.
Right. There was a DYFS worker, a woman we'll call Mrs. S, sitting in an adjacent observation room behind a two-way mirror.
And Mrs. S was secretly taking her own independent real-time notes during that entire 70-minute unrecorded interview.
Imagine the tension of that discovery.
You have the official police report, which reads like a clear-cut confession of abuse. But then you contrast Detective M's polished summary with the raw reality of Mrs. S's hidden notes, and the lie is entirely exposed.
Mrs. S's notes prove that Detective M was relentlessly asking leading questions. She wasn't listening to Gabriella. She was feeding Gabriella the facts of the crime she wanted to prosecute.
It exposes extreme omission bias. The detective was actively scrubbing any evidence the child provided that didn't fit the predetermined narrative.
They were literally systematically constructing a false crime in real time.
But even with this heavily manipulated file, the system tried to correct itself. The filtration system gave it one more shot.
When the prosecution presented this manufactured case to the first grand jury, the grand jury saw through the haze.
They looked at the lack of physical evidence, they noticed the twisted timeline, the lack of medical corroboration, and they returned a no bill.
They refused to indict Robert. They essentially told the state, you don't have a case here.
The filter worked, the grand jury did its job. But instead of looking at the evidence and backing down, the prosecution goes nuclear.
They decide that if they can't prove Robert committed this crime, they are going to prove he is a monster anyway.
They go back to the ex-wife for dirt. They decide to weaponize his past. And they dig up an ex-girlfriend, who we'll call M, from 10 years prior.
At the time of that relationship, Robert was in his early 20s, and she was almost 16.
The prosecution decides to seek a completely separate indictment for this decade-old relationship and use it in the current trial as propensity evidence.
Because they severely lacked actual forensic proof that Robert abused his toddler, they attempted to substitute that missing medical proof with character assassination.
They wanted the jury to look at the age gap from a decade ago and believe he was simply the type of person who would commit a sexual crime against a child.
Since they couldn't prove the facts, they put his character on trial. Which brings us to New Jersey Rule of Evidence 404B and what is known as the Cofield test.
Walk us through how a judge is supposed to handle this, because merging two completely separate cases from entirely different decades sounds highly prejudicial. How is a jury supposed to remain objective?
The rules of evidence exist entirely to prevent a jury from convicting a defendant based on emotion, disgust, or past mistakes, rather than the facts of the actual crime charged.
Right.
The Caulfield test is a four-pronged mandatory legal test designed to act as a strict gatekeeper. To let past bad acts into a trial, the evidence must be relevant to a material issue.
Okay.
It must be similar in kind and reasonably close in time to the current charge. It must be supported by clear and convincing evidence. And the fourth, most critical prong. The probative value of the evidence must not be outweighed by its apparent prejudice.
I really want to emphasize that last point with an analogy. Probative value is the actual nutritional content of the evidence. Does it help prove the specific facts of the case?
And prejudice is the sugar. Does it just rile up the jury's emotions?
Exactly. The judge's job is to make sure the jury isn't just eating a diet of pure sugar and voting based on a sugar crash. And in this case, the state's request fails spectacularly.
A 10-year-old relationship with a near 16-year-old is not similar in kind to the physical abuse of a toddler.
It's not close in time, it was a decade ago. And the prejudice, the sugar, is massive.
And Judge C, who was presiding over the case, initially recognized this legal reality. In his early rulings, he recognized the evidence from a decade ago was far too remote and overwhelmingly prejudicial to Robert's right to a fair trial.
But then, without any new legal precedent being introduced, without any new facts coming to light, Judge C executes an inexplicable, highly controversial judicial flip-flop.
He completely reverses his own ruling and allows the prosecution to merge the cases.
It created an ex-girlfriend bridge that allowed the prosecution to completely bypass the burden of forensic proof regarding the toddler.
It's exactly like a magician's misdirection.
Right.
The prosecution is standing in front of the jury saying, look over here at this scandalous, uncomfortable 10-year-old relationship. Stare at that. So you don't notice we have zero medical proof of abuse over there.
So they hit Robert from two sides simultaneously. They mix the files, they muddy the waters, they push the grand jury indictment through, and we head into the first trial.
And what makes this trial so extraordinary is that the prosecution's central strategy completely backfires on the witness stand.
The prosecution calls the ex-girlfriend, M, to testify. They expect her to paint Robert as a predator.
But instead of painting him as a monster, she sits on the stand and testifies that he was a normal, loving father.
She explicitly states under oath that she saw zero inappropriate behavior ever occur.
And crucially, she corroborates the defense's timeline regarding the physical injuries.
She testifies that she was physically present for the monkey bars incident, validating the exact mechanics of the straddle injury that the defense had been arguing all along.
The state's star character witness just effectively exonerated him and destroyed the prosecution's physical timeline.
Any logical reading of the room says the case should be over, Robert should go home.
But in closing arguments, the assistant prosecutor realizes she has lost the factual battle, so she does something horrifying.
She explicitly tells the jury to ignore the conflicting timelines.
She tells them to ignore the mountain of clean medical evidence.
She urges them to vote purely on their emotional revulsion to the accusations.
She weaponized the biological, deep-seated drive of a jury to protect a child. A jury hears the word abuse, and their instinct is to protect.
Blinded by the prejudice of the propensity evidence, distracted by the decade-old relationship, and overwhelmed by the prosecutor's impassioned rhetoric, the jury abandons the factual evidence.
They return a guilty verdict. Robert Roetman receives a 23-year sentence in a state penitentiary.
An innocent man with an airtight alibi, verified by a Navy deployment schedule, locked in a steel cage for over 2 decades. It is the ultimate nightmare.
But thankfully, the story doesn't end in that prison cell.
Because a foundation built on sand, altered police notes, and procedural errors cannot withstand rigorous higher judicial scrutiny forever.
It takes years of his life, but the appellate division finally reviews the trial record.
When the appellate division looks at the transcripts, they zero in precisely on Judge C's Caulfield test flip-flop.
They recognize the magician's misdirection for what it was.
The appellate judges declare that the inclusion of the propensity evidence regarding the ex-girlfriend was a fatal legal mistake.
They rule that it irreparably poisoned the jury's ability to objectively evaluate the actual evidence regarding the toddler. Because of this severe judicial error, they throw out the conviction entirely.
Which brings us to the precipice of the second trial in 2008. Robert has been sitting in prison, losing the prime years of his life.
The state realizes their case is incredibly weak now that the appellate court has stripped away their ex-girlfriend's smokescreen. They have to actually prove the abuse, which they know they can't do.
So they offer Robert a plea deal.
They offer him time served, immediate freedom. He can walk out of prison today. All he has to do is plead guilty to a lesser crime and register under Megan's law.
We have to analyze the profound psychological torture of that moment. The justice system is essentially holding the keys to his physical freedom and saying, we will let you out of this cage, but you have to swear on a Bible to tell the truth just so you can legally lie and say you are a monster.
They are asking an innocent man to legally validate the exact lie that destroyed his life.
And the emotional weight of that choice is staggering. Because if he says no, he risks going back to trial and getting hit with another 23 years. He could die in prison.
So what does this all mean for Robert? We have his exact sentiments from the source journals. He was absolutely adamant. He said, I told them I didn't do anything wrong. I never did anything to hurt my daughter. I cannot get on the stand and say I'm guilty of something when I didn't do anything.
He turns down the deal. He chooses to risk decades of his life for the bedrock principle of the truth.
And that profound courage allows his defense attorney, Jay Atkins, to prepare for round 2.
And Atkins' strategy for this second trial is nothing short of brilliant.
In high-stakes criminal trials, defense attorneys usually spend a fortune hiring expensive counter-experts to contradict the state's experts. It becomes a battle of credentials.
Atkins doesn't do that. He realizes the truth is already in the file. He simply subpoenas the exact experts the state actively tried to hide from the first jury.
He flips the state's own filtration system against them.
He calls therapist Mrs. C to the stand, who proves Gabriella was already using the new husband's last name before the allegations even peaked, and confirms that no DYFS referral was ever made.
He calls the forensic psychiatrist, Dr. L, who expertly walks the jury through the severe adult coaching, the implanted vocabulary, the fart joke, and the psychological mechanics of source monitoring errors.
He calls DYFS worker Mrs. S, who exposes her hidden notes from behind the two-way mirror, proving the police manipulation and relentless leading questions by Detective M.
And the killing blow to the state's case. Atkins calls the Columbia-trained pediatrician Dr. Y. He has Dr. Y walk the jury step by step through 47 perfectly clean contemporaneous medical exams.
Atkins forces the jury to look at the unfiltered objective truth that the prosecution spent years trying to bury. He doesn't rely on rhetoric or emotion. He intellectually demolishes the state's case by simply presenting the bedrock, documented reality.
And on November 5th, 2008, the truth finally cuts through the noise. The jury looks at the facts, they ignore the emotional manipulation, and they return an acquittal on all counts.
Robert Roetman is fully, legally exonerated. He is a free man.
But we have to acknowledge the collateral damage. He lost a decade of his life. He lost the opportunity to raise his daughter. A piece of paper saying, not guilty, doesn't refund time.
And to truly grasp the rot at the center of this systemic failure, to understand how this happened in the first place, we have to look at the epilogue. What happened to the assistant prosecutor who orchestrated this nightmare?
You would hope that after an appellate court overturns a conviction due to prosecutorial overreach, there would be an investigation. But she didn't face any immediate reprimand.
In fact, she built a fearsome reputation on this wrongful conviction. She used cases like Robert's to climb the judicial ladder, and she eventually achieved one of the highest legal positions in the state of New Jersey.
She became Superior Court Judge S. She was handed a gavel, a robe, and the immense, unchecked power to preside over the lives of others in family court.
But the truth has a way of eventually catching up to bad actors. In 2018, the New Jersey Supreme Court issued a formal, scathing disciplinary order.
Judge S. was permanently removed from the bench and barred from ever holding judicial office in the state again. Her career was destroyed.
And the reason why is poetic justice at its most staggering.
The Supreme Court documents detail her exact transgressions. She was removed for knowingly and purposefully abusing the immense power of her judicial office to illegally intervene in a child custody dispute.
And she didn't do it for a matter of law. She did it on behalf of a personal friend, her former law clerk.
Let me break down the how of what she did because it sounds like a movie villain.
She literally picked up the phone, called the Fort Lee Police Department, and falsely claimed to be the emergent duty judge for the night.
She entirely fabricated a non-existent court order to have armed police officers interrupt a father's lawful custody time.
She had the police essentially kidnap a child under the color of law to hand the child over to her friend.
And when the higher courts started investigating her, she lied under oath and submitted forged, altered, and cropped telephone records to cover her tracks.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the specific, calculated details of her downfall mirror the exact tactics she deployed against Robert Roetman 2 decades earlier in 1999.
Fabricating evidence, hiding the objective truth, utilizing the awesome power of the state to aggressively bypass the legal rights of fathers in order to alter the outcomes of child custody battles.
She operated under the hubris that the system would always protect her.
It fundamentally proves that the justice system in Robert's case wasn't just broken. It wasn't just making an innocent administrative mistake.
It was actively, maliciously corrupted by a bad actor who knew exactly how to dismantle the filters meant to protect us.
So let's look at the immense scope of what we've covered today. We started with a deployed father receiving a devastating letter in total isolation.
We explored the deep psychological weaponization of toddler cognitive development and the aggressive, calculated reinterpretation of mundane injuries like a monkey bar's fall.
We saw the malicious suppression of 47 clean medical exams. We analyzed the fatal, manipulative use of propensity evidence to blind a jury.
And finally, we witnessed a triumphant, hard-fought acquittal based on objective medical truth, followed by the ultimate poetic downfall of a corrupt prosecutor.
The absolute frailty of our institutions is what stands out to me. We all want the justice system to act like an MRI machine. You put the facts in, and it provides a clean, unbiased image of the truth.
But this case proves that the machine is operated by human beings. If a toddler's memory can be edited like a rough draft by a malicious parent and accepted without question by a tunnel vision investigator who destroys her own notes, how many other foundations of sand are currently holding up convictions right now?
For you, the listener, the takeaway is constant vigilance. Keep asking the hard questions. Keep demanding the underlying evidence, even when the narrative seems entirely convincing.
This raises an important, deeply unsettling question to leave you with. When a justice system allows an interrogator to permanently destroy their handwritten notes and legally replace them with a polished, highly edited summary, what happens to our collective concept of history?
If a single DYFS worker hadn't been taking secret notes behind a two-way mirror that day, reality itself would have been successfully and permanently rewritten by the state.
How much of our recorded legal truth, the history that sits in filing cabinets determining the fate of human lives, is just a successfully hidden rough draft?
That is something to really mull over tonight, because out there right now, someone else might be on a deployment, completely unaware that someone is actively constructing a narrative to pull them into the fight of their life.
Next time on our deep dive, we are going to examine the harrowing long-term reality of parental alienation. We will explore the chilling, actual voice of Gabriella many years later, and how the trial presented the intense psychological drive to erase Robert from her life permanently. You won't want to miss it.